Hello everyone, it's TopHATwaffle here once again to continue working on our Counter-Strike Global Offensive competitive level. Today we'll be taking a look at info decals and info overlays. These are ways that we can apply materials on top of another material in our level. This is useful for things such as paint, graffiti, little leaves on the ground, dirt, tracks, and of course custom textures that we can create. Let's start off by opening Hammer. You can do so by going to the Tools section under Library, loading up CSGO SDK, and then Hammer World Editor. Once that's open, let's go ahead and get started in our level. There's a ton of decals and overlays that we can use that are shipped with Hammer. If we start by going over to our texture browser and just do a search for decal, we'll get a whole bunch of decals that are included with the game. We can scroll down and find, say, this graffiti. And with that as our active texture, we can click this decal tool over on the left, and then just click on a brush face and it will apply it to the wall. You can do this as many times as you want, but over here, you'll notice that it's not displaying properly. The preview in Hammer for info decals isn't always 100% accurate. If I leave this one on the wall here, we'll check it out in game and it'll display fine. I can search for another decal and then place it here. One thing you'll notice is that if we try to rotate a decal, we're unable to do so. Rotation and scaling for decals is set in the VMT file for that decal. No matter how many times we try to resize this, it'll always go back to the same size. Let's select a dirt decal and then just apply it right here next to this wall. If we take a look at the info decal settings, they're pretty barren. The only useful one is the texture, which you can change by clicking the browse button, but it's usually easier to just select it as your active texture and then apply it to the face. You can also select low priority to yes. The default is no. This means that the engine can replace it to accommodate new decals generated in-game, but if you're placing this in Hammer, odds are you want it to always be present, so we'll just leave that as no. Let's compile this so we can take a look at it in-game. Here we are inside a game. We have our info decal right here, which is applying fine. The info decal on the curved wall is applying much better than it did in Hammer, though there is a slight issue with it clipping off on where a new brush begins. We'll resolve this later with an info overlay. Over by the dirt decal that we've placed on the ground, it somehow managed to end up on the wall. Info decals can spread themselves to other geometry if the engine thinks that it's necessary. This is again another thing that will be fixed by using an info overlay. So far we've only placed 3 info decals, and 2 of them have had issues not rendering fully or putting themselves on walls where we didn't want them. And I forced them to be this way so we could take a look at some of the pitfalls of info decals. Info decals are very cheap to render, so you should use them where you can. The info overlay entity that I was talking about is a much more powerful version of info decal. It supports rotation, translation, and a ton of other features. But this is slightly more expensive, and there's a hard limit of 512 of these in the game. Meaning that if we have a decal heavy level and we're using info overlays, it's very possible that we will hit that info overlay limit. I personally like to use info decals where possible, just due to their cheap nature. What if we wanted to use our own materials for an info decal? We start out by creating the VTF image like I outlined in the previous video. I already have a few created here of DDK and James, and if we do a search for DE Metro, we can see them in all their glory right here. Let's select James, and I figured that these will contain advertisements once the level's complete, so what better place to put James? And look at apparently just his glorious forehead. Let's zoom out and take a look at what's happening here. If we place him out here, we can see that he is a giant. That is a giant James. If we place Dan there, he's giant as well. This is because the scale is not set for use on an info decal. Let's open up the VMT file for James, and we want to start by adding 2 new lines. The first line is $decal1. This tells the game to expect this to be a decal texture. Then we'll do $decal scale, and we'll set this to 0.25. The expected or normal value is 0.25, and then you can adjust from there. Let's click save, and then we can reapply him here. While that's better, it's still not the right size. If we go back to the VMT file, we can throw a 1, so it's 0.125, and hit save. The info decal won't update right away, so we can just delete it and then replace it. This is the correct scale that I wanted. Let's do something a little bit different with Dan. Let's select him and then place him on the wall here. Let's open up his VMT file, and then let's copy the decal and decal scale from James. The additional line that I want to add onto the DDK VMT is base texture transform. This will allow me to rotate, transform, change the center of the material. I'll use it to rotate this info decal since we can't do that inside a hammer. If I do $ base texture transform, and then we open another quote. This quote is required since we're going to be putting a string in here. We start with center 0.5, 0.5. This is determining the center XY of the image. Scale 1, 1. This determines the scale on X and Y for the image. And now rotate, and I'll do 90 for 90 degrees. Lastly, we'll add translate 0, 0, which will perform 0xy translation of the image. Let's close that quote and hit save, and Dan has rotated. His scale is still incorrect because we didn't reapply it. He's still rotated the wrong way. I figured he'd be popping out from behind this pillar here. If we go back to his VMT, I can throw a negative in front of this. And there we go, he's the right way now. I'll just nudge him into place. And let's compile that and check it out in game. Here we are in game. If I walk over, we can see Party Hat James right here. And over here we got DDK looking pretty fly for a white guy. Let's replace our two info decals over here with info overlays instead. I can start by just deleting both of these, and then going to my info overlay tool. If I click on a wall, it will automatically apply the info overlay to it. Moving to that in my 2D view, I can use the grab points and resize this. It will then remember that scaling. I can also rotate it. And if I move it to cross brushes, we'll notice that it stops rendering. This helps combat the problem that info decals have where they render on brushes that we don't want them to. Info overlays will only render on brush faces that we tell them to. Opening the object properties, we can see we have a brush face here and the brush face ID. If we click pick, the current selected brush faces will turn red. We can hold Control and click on another face and then click apply, and the info overlay will now spread across multiple brushes. If I hit the X key, this will enable perspective editing, and I can move this around in my 3D view along with resizing it and rotating it. I'm not a huge fan of Hammer's implementation of perspective editing, as it can tend to lead to some brushes becoming off grid. This results in me usually using the 2D grid for brushes and the perspective grid for certain things, kind of like this. Over on the curved wall, we can place another info overlay, and it's still clipped off and not rendering properly. If I double click on it, we just need to set the brush faces again, and then click apply. We can then rotate it, and then scale it up some. Info overlays have the ability of render orders. If we look for a paint overlay, there's a ton of them here. If I grab this paint swatch 01A and I drop another overlay on top of this object here, pick this brush face, usually we'll see this used to help promote better player readability, but in this case we'll make it look like someone's graffitied down here and then the establishment has come down here and painted over it. If we open its object properties, we have render order and it's set to 0. In the help section, we see that higher values render after lower values. What this means is that the lower value of 0 will be drawn first, and then the higher value is rendered after, meaning it will be on top. If I set the paint value to render order 1 and then click apply, inside of game, this paint will render above the big graffiti behind it. That's basic overlay implementation. Let's take a look at that inside of game. Inside of game now, we can see that the big overlay on the rounded wall is rendering perfectly and it's not clipped off anywhere. The big that has the paint over it is also working properly as well. Using the render order is a great way to add, again, that little bit of extra detail in your level. One of the largest advantages of using info overlays is their ability to be tiled and also vertex manipulated with each other. If I browse for my station decal texture here, this is the decal that will run along the edge of the station track. I'll select a few of my ground pieces and then hide everything else since I don't need them to be seen. Now what I want to do is scale down this overlay by pressing Ctrl M to bring up the transform window and scale it down by 0.5 in X and Y. This makes it approximately the size that I want it to be. I'll rotate it 90 degrees and I'll end up wanting it to match up with the edges of these faces here. I'll start by approximately positioning it where the vertexes are on the brush. From there, I need to add more repeatingness to this texture. If I just drag it, it's going to elongate. If I turn off texture lock though, I can now drag it and it will tile indefinitely. This is one of the greatest features of an info overlay. The only downside is they constantly flicker and cause Z-fighting inside of Hammer. We just kind of have to work around that. I now want to resize it so it fits up to about right here. And since it has segments, I'll resize it until I'm at an even number of segments. And now I'll shift drag to create a copy. With both of these selected, I'll maximize my 3D viewport and then click on the Info Overlay tool again. This will show me the vertex points of these two overlays. I can grab and individually move each of these overlay points. If I drag one and hold shift, they'll snap to each other. What I'm using this to do is to bring these so they follow the edge of this brush. And I'll do the same for this one over here. This one here is unable to cross the boundary of the second brush, and I'll use this as a point where I can just add another info overlay. If I turn wireframe on, I'm easily able to see the overlays on top of these brushes a bit better. Since I already have these kind of the scale that I want, I can just shift drag them over, bring up their object properties, and then change the brush face to this one here. If you change the brush face and it doesn't update right away, you just need to move it around for it to update. Again, just using the vertex points here, I'm just going to snap them to each other. This one refuses to snap to the other brush, so I'll select this face and this face so it can be on both at the same time. Going back to the vertex mode again, it will now snap to the other brush. That's a pretty good set of overlays for this quick try here. We can go back to textured and they'll start flickering again, but that's the effect that I wanted it to have. If I unhide the entire scene, we can see that that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and compile it so we can check those out. Here in game, our tiling info overlays that we just placed work great, and I think that they look pretty good. I hope you enjoyed this look at placing info decals and info overlays inside of our level. Hopefully you'll take advantage of it in your own works. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to join us again tomorrow for the next one, and stay frosty.